I'm Neat to Hone, and we're in the midst of limited review week here on my channel. We're going to talk about every single card in the set, of course, set 2019. We've already looked at white and blue. Today we continue with black. Tomorrow we continue with red, and so on. In these videos I use a letter grading system to convey how good I think a card is going to be. If you want to understand more about my grading system, there's a link in the description below. Let's go ahead and get started with the first black card, which is Abnormal Endurance. For one generic and one black, it's a common instant that says, until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When the creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. We've basically seen this card before in Supernatural Stamina, which did the exact same thing and had a synonymous name, but it cost one less mana. Supernatural Stamina was pretty nice. A trick that makes your creature able to kill something it couldn't before and keeps your creature alive is strong, especially if that creature hasn't entered the battlefield ability, because you get to trigger it all over again. That said, increasing the mana cost by 100% does decrease how good this trick is, but that's okay, as Supernatural Stamina is one of the best combat tricks in recent memory. This one is still an okay playable for any black deck, but it is a card that will also be easy to cut. I'm going to give it a C-. Next we have Blood Divination, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 3 cards. So this is a first of a few cards in black that are focused on sacrificing. We see that pretty typically in black, but the black-red archetype in general is interested in doing sacrificey things, and that's what Blood Divination does. This would have been pretty powerful in Dominaria's black decks with saplings all over the place, but I think it is less powerful here. There isn't a creature token-centric archetype in black. Instead, the ideal thing to do with this is sacrifice something that gives you value when it dies, or better, use a threat and effect to steal your opponent's creature and then sacrifice it. That's some insane value. That said, there will be a lot of times where you just can't get this thing in a good position because your board just doesn't work that way. Like you have 2 creatures and you need them to block, you can't really cast Blood Divination. It's going to be better in the late game than anywhere else in most scenarios. I'm going to start it at C with the caveat that sometimes a deck will come together where it really overperforms. Next we have Bog Stomper, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 6/5 creature, a beast at common. It's a vanilla creature, but it brings some reasonable stats to the table, so I think it is a little better than a typical D or D+ vanilla creature with mediocre stats. Not by a lot, mind you, but I can see a lot of black decks running this at the top of their curve when they don't find a better option, and I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Bone Dragon, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/4 dragon skeleton at Mythic Rare. It has flying, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic and 2 black, exile 7 other cards from your graveyard, and return Bone Dragon from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Yeah, this is incredibly powerful. It's hard to find anything wrong with it. It boasts impressive stats and refuses to stay dead. You do need some ample graveyard resources to bring him back, but just the fact that you can play him early and say, if you can't kill this, you're probably dead, and then several turns later just bring him back and say the same thing, makes him pretty insane. It's a first pickable bomb and a solid A. Next we have Child of Night, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 vampire at common with lifelink. 2 mana 2/1 with lifelink is nothing special, even in a set where life gain is an archetype, which it is in black-white. I don't think this is the kind of card you feel bad about having as a 2-drop, but I think you can do a lot better. I'm going to give it a C-. Obviously, it does go up slightly, probably to solid C status in a very synergistic black-white deck. Next, we have Death Baron, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 2/2 zombie wizard at rare, and it says skeletons you control and other zombies you control get +1/+1 and have death touch. This set has several skeletons and zombies, which makes playing the Death Baron possible. How many are there? Well, at common and uncommon, there are 2 skeletons and 7 zombies. That means your average black deck will end up with a few of these creatures without even trying, and as a result, he probably gets like a solid D in your typical limited deck that has like, let's say 2 or 3 zombies or skeletons in it. That said, as you get more skeletons and zombies, his value goes up drastically, and he's like a B- in a deck where you really get there with those creatures, let's say with 7 or more of them, and I don't think that's impossible. There's enough at common and uncommon for that to happen. Pumping and Death Touch can be a real beating for your opponent. I wouldn't take it early despite the high ceiling, just because it has such a low floor. Next, we have Demon of Catastrophes, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 demon at rare. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature, and it has flying and trample. Sort of reminiscent of Zahid, which we just saw in Dominaria. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. If you can jump through some hoops, you can have a 4 mana massive flyer. In this case, a 6/6 that also has trample. The hoops to jump through here are easier than even Zahid was, but also costlier. Tapping an artifact is way less of a cost than giving up a creature. That said, black seems well suited to have creatures who do nice things when they die, and if you can combo this with those, that's pretty sweet. Even if you can't, giving up your 2-drop on turn 4 for a 6/6 with flying and trample is worth it for sure. I think he's a pretty first pickable card and a solid B. Next, we have Diregraph Ghoul, which for 1 black is a 2/2 zombie at uncommon, and it enters the battlefield tapped. 1 mana 2/2s already aren't great in limited because they get outclassed so quickly. I think people often overrate them because a 1 mana 2/2 is so good in Constructed. Because in Constructed, you can have a critical mass of cards that allow your deck to consistently curve out, but that doesn't happen in most limited formats. Although, if this format is anything like our last core set, Magic Origins, then curving out and killing people may be a real possibility. This 1 mana 2/2 comes with a significant downside. If you get him late and he has to come into play tapped, it could really cost you. That's a big downside over, a 2 mana 2/2, which could just be blocking for you. Obviously, early he's better. He comes down as a 1 mana 2/2 and starts attacking very quickly, but at other stages, it's not so good. I think it's a C-. Next, we have Doomed Dissenter, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 human at common, and when it dies, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Last time we saw this, it was pretty nice. It was a format that had several creatures who put -1/-1 counters on your own creatures in exchange for being huge, so the Dissenter was a great target for those counters. This format doesn't have the -1/-1 counter thing going again, but it does have several cards that pay you off for sacrificing creatures, a couple of which we've already seen, and a few zombie synergies at the higher rarities, one of which we've already seen as well. Sacrificing this to your Demon of Catastrophes on turn 4 is a messed up thing to do, and I hope to get to do that a few times. All told, I still think he's just a solid C, but he is perhaps the best or second best sacrifice fodder in the entire set, so Black-Red especially is going to want him. Next, we have Duress, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. Your opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-creature or non-land card from it, and they discard it. We see this card all the time. As usual, it is a sideboard card. You don't want to mainboard it because it hits such a narrow number of cards. Limited decks are predominantly creatures and lands, so you're going to just whiff with this a significant portion of the time if you play it mainboard. I think I'm just going to give it an F there. It is a C out of your sideboard, though. 1 always runs into people who are playing a bunch of removal or have big bomby spells, and in that case, you bring Duress in out of your sideboard, and it does a good job there. Next, we have Epicure of Blood, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 vampire at common, and whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. A 5 mana 4/4 is pretty mediocre stats-wise, but this one does come with a text box some of the time. A life gain build around, the Epicure really wants you to gain life so it can do some extra damage to your opponent. But honestly, it's probably the weakest life gain payoff in the set, coming with an overcosted body and a pretty mild upside. Not saying you don't want to play it in a black-white deck with a bunch of life gain, just don't go after it super hard unless you're already firmly in the life gain deck. And even then, I think sometimes you cut him for other cards. All that means he is like a D in your typical limited deck and a C in the life gain deck. Next, we have Fell Spectre, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon Spectre, and it's a 1/3 with flying, and it's a Spectre, so of course it does something regarding discarding. In this case, when it enters the battlefield, your opponent discards a card, and whenever they discard a card, they lose 2 life. A 4 mana 1/3 with flying is pretty awful stats, but one that makes your opponent discard something and does 2 damage to them off the bat, that's not bad. It isn't going to be easy to cash in the discard damage more than just when you play the card, but there are some other good ways to cash in on it, with the blue-black Signpost uncommon first coming to mind. But yeah, I'd play this even if it was a 4 mana 1/3 flyer that made them discard a card and only did 2, and that's what it's going to be most of the time. And I think that it's actually something like a C+. Next, we have Fraying Omnipotence, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says each player loses half their life, then discards half the cards in their hand, then sacrifices half the creatures they control, round up each time. Talk about chaos. I don't think this plays very well limited. Don't get me wrong, there are scenarios where it will be good. You have very few cards in your hand and your opponent has a bunch. Your opponent has a board filled with small creatures, and you have some big ones that can help you take the game, but you just can't get those scenarios to happen frequently enough to reliably have this actually do something. Frequently, it just leaves the game more or less the way it was. Whoever was ahead is still ahead after this. Because of how erratic this is, I'm just going to give it an F. Next, we have Gravedigger, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 zombie at uncommon. When it enters a battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Gravedigger's back, and every time it's around, it's one of Black's limited cards. We've seen it tons of times, most recently in Amonkhet. Just like in that set, he is uncommon, which I think is a good thing. In past core sets, Gravedigger at common made Black decks a little overpowered. So what makes this good? Well, a 4-mana 2/2 obviously isn't good, but getting a creature back from your graveyard at the same time makes this a 2-for-1. It has 2 power, so it can trade with something, in addition to getting you a card back from your graveyard. It gets even better if you have creatures with Into the Battlefield, or death triggers, or just big bombing creatures, as the value of the cards he is getting you go way up. Gravedigger is first pickable in some weaker packs, and I'm going to give him a B-. Next we have Graveyard Marshal, which is 2 black mana for a rare zombie soldier who's a 3/2. He has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic and a black, and exile a creature card from your graveyard, and you get to create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. This thing is kind of insane. A 2-mana 3/2 does great on the vanilla test, and then this comes with the incredibly powerful ability to turn any creature card in your graveyard into a 2/2 zombie token. This means he's great on turn 2 because of those stats, and excellent late because it can turn your graveyard into a horde of zombies. It does cost double black, but that's not a huge hurdle since playing it late is so good. I think you should first pick this almost any time you see it, and I'm giving it a B+. Next we have Hired Blade, which for 2 generic and a black is a common human assassin and a 3/2, and it has flash. He seems pretty fine to me. Putting flash on black creatures is cool flavor-wise, I think. We haven't seen a lot of it, but assassins having flash does make some sense. A vanilla 3-mana 3/2 is like a D+, but coming with flash makes this significantly better. You can flash it in to kill in any X3 in combat, and you can leave mana up for other spells, and if the opportunity to cast them doesn't arise, you can always flash him in and suddenly have more damage to hit your opponent with. He's still not great or anything, but I'd feel fine about having 1 or 2 of these in most of my decks, which means it's a C. Next we have Infectious Horror, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 zombie horror at common, and whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 2 life. I don't know why they print cards like this sometimes. Like, it's just so bad. A 4-mana 2/2 is horrendous, and making it so that it does 2 to your opponent when it attacks doesn't really get around that at all. Your opponent can just block it and kill it in basically all board states. Sure, giving this evasion could be nasty, I guess, but just give a better creature evasion, not this thing. This is just an F. I predict it to be the kind of card that is perpetually the last one in packs. Next we have Infernal Reckoning, which for 1 black mana is a rare instant, and it says exile target colorless creature. You gain life equal to its power. This is another card that wasn't printed with limited in mind at all. It's here to hate on constructed. It was printed as a sideboard answer against Eldrazi in the Eternal formats. There might be a rare occasion where you side this in because your opponent has several artifact creatures, but there aren't actually that many artifact creatures in this set, and so that doesn't seem very likely to me, and I'm just going to give it an F. Next we have Infernal Scarring, which for 1 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has, when this creature dies, draw a card. We saw this card in our last core set, Magic Origins, a few years ago. That was a set which was very aggressive, and this card was like kind of okay there, but still wasn't incredible. No toughness boost means it is kind of difficult for you to make the creature into a better attacker. This is better to put on like an evasive creature. And sure, unlike a lot of auras, at least this one replaces itself, but still, I don't really like it. I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Isareth the Awakener, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 human wizard at rare with Death Touch, and whenever it attacks, you can pay X. When you do, return target creature with converted mana cost X from your graveyard to the battlefield with a corpse counter on it. If that creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. A 3-mana 3/3 with Death Touch, already a great card. Already a card you play every time you're playing black. Creatures with Death Touch are great because they can trade for anything. This particular one comes with another huge block of text that is very powerful. Death Touch creatures are already kind of a pain to block, and this one gets to bring back a buddy from the graveyard every time she attacks. So she's really good and probably the best 3-drop in the set, and that's not a bad distinction to have. She's a bomb, I think, as a 3-drop, which you don't see a lot of. I think the last time I really considered a 3-drop in a format to be a bomb was like Tireless Tracker, and I think she sort of can be very similar. She'll bring you a lot of value and good stats in addition to Death Touch, just like the Tireless Tracker did. I mean, he didn't have Death Touch, but he brought you a lot of value over the course of a game. And I'm giving her an A-. I'm happy to first pick her over even premium removal. The ability to just keep bringing things back from your graveyard is great. So black has 2 rares, one that costs 2 and one that costs 3, that do things with your graveyard, and they're both like super efficient in addition. And getting both of them together would be a lot of fun, I think. Anyway, next we have Lich's Caress, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a common sorcery. It says destroy target creature, you gain 3 life. This is a good removal spell. Sure, it's a little bit clunky at 5, and if this format turns out to be super fast, this might slip some. But in most limited formats, this would be really good. It even does a good job of making up for the fact that it's a little clunky. You know, you might have to use an entire turn to cast this since it costs 5 mana. But by gaining you life, you know, it sort of counteracts the fact that you're not actually adding to the board that turn, you're only subtracting from it and gaining a bit of life. This is a good removal spell, and, you know, life gain is relevant in this format. Any deck, any black deck will play this, though. Just, you know, a little bit of life gain, extra bonus points there. And I think I'll feel fine about picking this with my first pick. I think it's a B-. Next, we have Liliana, Untouched by Death, who for 2 generic and 2 black is a legendary Planeswalker Liliana at Mythic Rare who enters with 4 loyalty counters. Her +1 says put the top 3 cards of your library in your graveyard. If at least one of those is a zombie card, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Her -2 says target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of zombies you control. And her -3 says you may cast zombie cards from your graveyard this turn. Look, they printed a Liliana who isn't busted, and in fact, I don't actually think she's very good. Along with Death Baron, she is a zombie build-around. She's actually terrible and basically unplayable if your deck doesn't have a decent number of zombies. And that's kind of sad for a Planeswalker, to be like utterly unplayable unless you have a certain creature type. But that's what she is. She does literally nothing if you don't have zombies in your deck. So you need to have zombies. And that means she's not a first pickable Planeswalker in most cases. It could be fun to first pick her and really hope black's open enough that you get all the zombies in the world, but that will backfire frequently. I mean, you don't want to be taking mediocre zombies over like removal spells just because you have Liliana. Overall, having those removal spells is going to be better than Liliana even when she's on. That said, if your deck has 10 zombies in it, she's pretty good. And 7, even if you have 7 or so, between 5 and 7 even, she gets to be decent. She's basically a straight up F, though, in a deck without a critical mass of zombies. And I think she does move all the way to A-, like that's her ceiling when you're like really getting there on zombies. But zombies, while there are a significant number of them, as we've already talked about in this video, it's not like it's like a really well-supported archetype or anything. Like there's not a zombie color pair. All the zombies are just mono black. So there's not a huge pool of zombies to draw from. She's going to be hard to make work. She'll be strong when you can, but sometimes you just won't be able to do it. Next, we have Liliana's Contract, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. And when it enters the battlefield, you draw 4 cards and you lose 4 life. It also says, although this part almost assuredly won't ever matter, she also says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 or more demons with different names, you win the game. 5 mana to draw 4 and lose 4 life is actually pretty nice, and that's really all this will be 99.9% of the time in limited. I haven't actually taken the time to count how many demons are in this set, but there may not even be 4 demons with different names, in which case 100% of the time the rest won't matter. This does provide you with some serious card advantage, and the life loss is going to be worth it in most games. Still, it is an enchantment that doesn't impact the board right away, so you have to wait for a time where the board is at parity or you're ahead to cast it. If you cast this when you're behind, there's a good chance you're just going to die. I think this is a C+. I wouldn't take it super early, but I also wouldn't cut it from most black decks. Next, we have Macabre Waltz, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says, return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, then discard a card. This is the kind of card black always gets at common, and in fact, this is the second time we've seen this particular card. But yeah, this is the kind of card every black deck is happy to have one of. They provide you with some serious value in the late game, after you've made a couple trades and just get your 2 best creatures back. If you're playing this, make sure to hold on to a land in your hand in case you draw it, since you don't really want to be discarding one of the creatures you get back. I don't think playing more than one of these is a great idea. This is because they are horrible in the early game and can really slow down your start by just rotting in your hand. I do think it's a C, though, and in an ideal world, I find one of these for my black deck every single time. Next, we have Mind Rot, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery that says, target player discards 2 cards. This is another core set staple, and as always, it's probably best out of the sideboard. Sure, it's technically a 2-for-1, but it is pretty awful once your opponent has an empty hand, and by awful, I mean useless. You basically want to cast this early, and you just can't guarantee that will happen. It's like a D as a main board card. You can put it in there if you desperately need a 23rd card, but it's not going to be great. However, it does get better against opponents who are playing grindier decks and are just holding on to cards all the time, since you're always likely to disrupt their plans with Mind Rot. So I think it's a C out of the sideboard. Having one in your sideboard every time you play black isn't something that I would mind. Next, we have Murder, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant that does destroy target creature. 3 simple words, 3 mana, instant speed, and can kill anything. Sure, you can't really splash it, but that's probably a good thing for the health of this format. It's just a B+, one of the best removal spells there is. Next, we have Nightmare's Thirst, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant that says you gain 1 life. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. Say hello to a life gain build around. In most cases, it will be best suited to the black-white deck, although sometimes any black deck can end up with enough life gain to play it. It also isn't completely unplayable alone. 1 mana to give something -1/-1 and gain you 1 life at instant speed is by no means good, but it isn't unplayable. I think it's probably a D+ in your typical limited deck in the format, and it can easily move up to the B- area in a deck that can really abuse it, where it can basically become a Path of Exile with no drawback. I think I would be pretty tempted, at least in the early stages of this format where I really want to see what this card can do, I would be tempted to take it early since its floor is, well, not great, playable, and it has a really high ceiling. So I'd be pretty tempted to take it early, in the early going of the format. It could be a card that ends up being worse just because gaining life isn't as consistent as it seems like it's going to be. But I think it looks pretty good. But you do need to have a decent amount of life gain or it's pretty mediocre. Next, we have Open the Graves, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. And it says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. On the face of this, it is a 5-mana enchantment that doesn't do anything immediately to improve your board state, and that can be bad. But being able to get value out of your creatures that die is pretty good. Suddenly your trades aren't really trades anymore, and you come out on the better end of all of them. That said, it does require you to have some board presence, and its ideal home is in the black-red sacrifice deck that can really easily get the zombie tokens and really easily use them. But I think it will be fine in most black decks, but not first pickable. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Phylactery Lich, which for 3 black mana is a 5/5 zombie at rare. It's indestructible. When it enters the battlefield, you have to put a Phylactery counter on an artifact you control, and when you control no permanents with Phylactery counters on them, sacrifice Phylactery Lich. While obviously powerful, this has 2 different things holding you back. 1, the triple black cost means it just won't be that easy to play in most limited decks, and 2, having artifacts for this to put the Phylactery counter on is a real cost, and black doesn't have any other artifact synergy apart from this 1 card, so basically almost no limited deck will be able to play this. For the odd mono-black artifact-heavy deck you end up with, it will be strong, but in most cases you just can't play it, and I'm going to give it an F to reflect that. I could give it a build-around grade, too, but it just seems too difficult to pull off to really deserve one. Next, we have Plague Mare, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 2/2 Nightmare Horse at uncommon. It can't be blocked by white creatures, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. Here's the black part of the Mare cycle. This one comes with a very powerful into the battlefield trigger. Note it only hits your opponent's creatures. That's actually pretty powerful on a 3-drop. You can easily set up attacks where this finishes off your opponent's creatures, and it obviously really punishes any X1s your opponent is playing. Just how good the Mare is in a given game is dependent on your opponent's deck, but I think it is a solid playable in any deck at all. Getting a 2-for-1 out of it isn't far-fetched, and I think I would consider first picking this in weaker packs, and that means it's a B-. Next, we have Ravenous Harpy, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/2 uncommon creature, a harpy, with flying, and you can pay 1 generic mana and sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on the harpy. A 3-mana 1/2 flyer isn't good, but I do like that it can eat other creatures for +1/+1 counters. This is another place where Doom Dissenter will be pretty nice. Still, making a deck where giving up creatures to pump this flyer isn't going to come together all the time. So overall, I think this is basically just filler, the kind of card you feel fine about having in your deck, but not much more. There will be some times when you can do some busted things with it and make it huge, but that will happen less often than it will just be a 3-mana 1/2 that can really threaten. There's really a threat of activation here, and that's what the real value's in, to do lethal. It can threaten to do lethal very early in the game if your opponent's not careful. But I think it's still just a C. You have to be really careful with that activated ability, and you don't want to stack too many counters on one creature. Too many eggs in one basket could be a dangerous thing to do. So yeah, I think it's just a C. Next, we have Reassembling Skeleton, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 Skeleton Warrior at uncommon. And when it's in your graveyard, you can pay 1 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This card's meant to slide into decks that can take advantage of sacrificing creatures, as he is constant sacrifice fodder. This certainly combos well with the Harpy we just looked at. I think he's also playable just in regular decks as a constant annoying presence, but he will be at his best in black-red decks that can abuse him. He's probably like a D in most decks and a C in a deck that has lots of sacrifice synergies. I think that is basically the only place where you feel good about playing him, and even then, like I said, he's just a C. A 2-mana 1/1 that refuses to die just isn't enough in most cases. Next, we have Rise from the Grave, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. And it says put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. This kind of effect always underperforms in Limited. I'm not saying it's bad, I just think people often imagine getting really sweet things out of the graveyard with it. I mean, I know I do. That's why it always underperforms for me, because in the end it doesn't do that often. And it will sometimes. Sometimes you will get something awesome. Your opponent will have something awesome that's dead, or you will. Other times, though, you'll have to pay 5 to get back a 3-mana 3/2 or something because you need to get a blocker somehow. It does get better the more bombs and removal your deck has, but I still think of these effects, especially at 5 mana, as being pretty medium, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Skeleton Archer, which for 3 generic and a black is a, guess what, Skeleton Archer at common. It's a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to any target. This is solid. A 4-mana 3/3 is fine. It's not great stats, but it's fine. Not too far off from what you'd expect. But the enter the battlefield trigger on it makes up for that. You can use it to do the last damage to a creature your opponent blocked with, to straight up kill an X1, and in a worst case scenario, if there's no good targets, you can still hit your opponent for 1. I'm going to give this a C. You'll play one of them in all your black decks and feel pretty alright about it. Next, we have Skymarch Bloodletter, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 vampire soldier at common with flying. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is another card from the fairly recent past. I think it'll be just as good here. A 3-mana 2/2 with flying is solid on the vanilla test, and to the enter the battlefield trigger here is nice. There's even a life gain deck in this format. It's one of black's better commons, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Sovereign's Bite, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says target player loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. I don't like this card. I don't ever like these sorts of effects that can only hit opponents. They don't impact the board in any way. Sure, 6 damage of life swing can be nice, and sometimes it will in games, but you also have to take into account all the times it rots in your hand or has a very minimal impact on the game. This card is pretty bad unless you're way ahead of your opponent and beating down on them. It isn't good if you're behind or at parity because it doesn't really do anything, and I'm going to give it an F. Next, we have Stitcher's Supplier, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 zombie at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. I don't know why they printed this, honestly, in this set. Like, it would be a cool card to have, like in Shadows over Innistrad for getting Delirium. It would have been awesome. There's not enough graveyard synergy in this set for this to matter most of the time. Sure, you've got Bone Dragon, you've got Raised from the Dead, you've got Macabre Waltz. There's a few things around, but most of them are good, even if you're not milling yourself. I mean, I guess the Bone Dragon could use the help because it needs 7 cards. But for the most part, milling yourself in this format just doesn't do enough. And this card just feels sort of like a weird outlier to me in this format. It's not terrible, because sometimes you will end up in a deck that has all those cards I just mentioned, and as a result, I'll give it a D- for that corner case. But most of the time, I don't think there's any reason to play this card. Next, you have Strangling Spores, which for 3 generic and a black is an instant at common, and it says target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. This is another good black common. Giving a creature -3/-3 at instant speed for 4 is an okay deal. These kinds of weakening effects always have a little extra utility too. Sure, you can just use it to straight up kill something with 3 or less toughness, but you can also use it to weaken a creature and then block it to kill it without losing your creature. I think this is another first pickable black removal spell. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Two-Headed Zombie, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/2 zombie at common with Menace. 4 mana for a 4/2 with Menace is some nice aggressive stats. A lot of the time, he'll at least get you a 2-for-1 thanks to that Menace. Menace creatures are always super amazing with combat tricks too, since you know your opponent has to set themselves up for a 2-for-1 if they want to kill it. So this will be a nice pickup for aggressive black decks, but it's not exactly something you're pumped about either. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Vampire Neonate, which for 1 black is a 0/3 vampire at common. You can pay 2 generic and tap it, and each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. This is pretty mediocre. A 1-mana 0/3 can block some things, and its activated ability gives you a source of inevitability for your game while also helping you stay alive. And yes, there is a deck, again, that cares about life gain, but I just don't feel like this does enough most of the time. I think it does just enough to escape the I wish this wasn't in my deck grade of a D and makes it to C-. Next, we have Vampire Sovereign, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a vampire at uncommon. It's a 3/4, it has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So this is basically Siege Rhino, if Siege Rhino only cost 1 color, traded in Trample for flying, and became a lot smaller, right? And, you know, I'm making that comparison to sort of be ridiculous, but at the same time, it's still a really good card because of the same reason Siege Rhino was. It's a 5-mana 3/4 flyer, which is already an okay deal on the vanilla test, and adding that Lightning Helix to your opponent's dome makes this even better. The Sovereign is much better than her bite, since she brings an impressive body with her. The 6-point life swing means you get value out of this, even if your opponent has to kill it, which is a good way to win a game in the long run. If you're causing a 6-point life swing and your opponent has to fire a removal spell off on this, you're going to come out ahead because you got value and your opponent really didn't. Overall, I think Vampire Sovereign is a B+. I think it's one of the best uncommons in the set, maybe the best uncommon. Murder's probably still better. But it's a very good uncommon, and that means Black has 2 crazy good uncommons, so that'll be fun. Next we have, and finally, we have Walking Corpse, which is 1 in a black for a 2/2 zombie. So there once was a time when vanilla grizzly bears were season limited, but creature power creep is real, and these days you'll only play these vanilla guys when you're desperate for a 2-drop, or in this case, if you have one of the rare or mythic zombie build-arounds. I'm going to give this a D+. I mean, you'll play it sometimes, and yeah. So that does it for Black. Tomorrow I'll be back with my thoughts on every single red card in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Don't forget to subscribe to catch the rest of my limited review.